Is a very exciting day, or mincha, or whatever. So today is a very exciting day. We are starting daf samach aleph, the fourth parak of Masechet Bava Batra, and we are on the first word on the line. So first word on the page, actually. So fourth parak of Bava Batra gets into start. We've had these mishnayot before, of course, but gets into the discussion about what is assumed when you sell something. You know, what is the, and obviously a lot of it has to do with local custom. Local custom develops over time. It's a very interesting thing because you're constantly quoting psukim, bless you. Like yesterday when we quoted Matovu even, or from the beginning of that, like we're quoting psukim, we're quoting like other earlier sources, but really it depends on local custom. And so, you know, these things all inform the milieu of what's expected and what changes over time. So today's Mishnah begins with a very straightforward case where you're mocher et habayit. First words in parak mocher et habayit, or conveniently, mocher et habayit, right? So a person goes to someone else and they sell a house. Now it turns out that a house could be a little bit ambiguous because you have, let's assume you had a one-room house, which doesn't necessarily mean that at all, but you had a house where you live. But right next to your house, you have this wonderful, I'll call it a storage shed, okay? The question is that included in the sale of the house, right? It's not, we'll see as the market develops, it's not something that you necessarily use for the same function as the house because you don't live in it or eat in it or sleep in it, but it's an ancillary thing that makes sense to have with the house. And you didn't specify. So says the Mishnah, HaMocher tabayit, if a person says, I'm selling you a house, lo machar yitziyah, it does not generally include the yitziyah, and I translate the yitziyah as like a storage shed. It doesn't have to be storage, but it's like a shed essentially that's next to the house, like another structure that is attached. And afal pieces the Mishnah, shehi ptucha letocho, even if there's an opening, so they're actually connected, not just attached, but there's an opening from the store, the yitziyah, to the bayit. It has a different function. It's not integral to the bayit. And unless you explicitly say, I'm selling it, it's not included. And further, says the Mishnah, and not only that, you're not including the yitziyah, but even if there's another room, now this gets a little bit closer because the other room has the same function as the outer room. But if it was, let's say you sold the house in a place where you're selling, again, it's hard to know exactly what the language is, and we'll go through it. But I'm selling you, Reuven says, I'm selling you my house, but within my house, not within my house, but deeper to my house, there's another inside room basically that you have to walk through my house to get to, but it's not automatically considered. Maybe I don't even live there, right? So that is not included in the sale of the house. So you don't include a cheder shelifnim himeno, a room that is inside the house that you sold. The lo atagag, and furthermore, this is also very interesting, you don't necessarily include the house, the roof, right? Because the roof might be owned by the previous person. He's going to sell the roof separately, and someone new will come live on the roof. So a roof is not included in the sale of a house. If the roof is surrounded by a makkah, I don't know how we translate makkah, like a boundary or something, right? Like a fence, essentially, but it's not what the word literally means.
A parapet.
But that's a Torah requirement.
Right. Well, wait, what's it, Miriam? What's the word you have?
Parapet.
Oh, wow. Okay, good French word.
Yeah, it is a French word. It totally is a French word.
Sounds like it. Okay, so you have your parapet around your roof, and the value.
Rashi have a comment on that?
I'm sorry, Charlie?
Does Rashi have a comment on that? No French?
Well, there's no Rashi here, so
this is not Rashi here.
Rashbam maybe didn't know much French. Either way, the point is
an English word too. Parapet is an English word.
Okay, whatever. If you have a boundary around your roof that encloses it to some extent, obviously it's not covered, but it's enclosed by a sarat tvachim, which remember is 2 amot, right? So like, I don't know, 3.5, 4 feet or something, 3.5 feet, let's say. So that's considered to be a notable space, in which case it is excluded from the sale, right? The whole point is if it's not, there's no usage of the roof, then it's included. But if it has a makkah around it, it's excluded from the sale. And Rabbi Yehuda says, furthermore, even if it doesn't have a makkah, if there's actually a doorway that goes to the roof, as opposed to, like a small ladder you climb up, but there's actually a real opening to the roof, so to speak, then then too, it is not necessarily sold unless it is explicitly stated. And we're going to see in the Gemara that because of this, they added a clause in their contracts talking about it includes everything, and you'd have to be very clear about it. Otherwise, we assume we're just selling you, the person is just selling you a place to live in, not the backyard necessarily. And again, it's not the yard, not the back house, not the yitziyah, which means shed or some kind of side room and not the roof. Now,
In
says,
other contexts, we define Yitzhak as an attic.
okay, well, let's see in a second. I'm not sure. I mean, you could use that context, but it's not what we necessarily mean here, but it's not very different. My Yitzhak. Now says the Gemara, what is a Yitzhak? So Hacha Tirkama here in Bavel, I guess they explained it as being an afta. I'm not sure if that helps everyone, but an afta, right? So Rashbam does bring a French word. All jokes aside, the Rashbam did quote French as well. I don't know anything about this word, afnatman. But he then explains it is a small binyan, a low structure that's next to the house, either on the side or behind it. And I don't think, I mean, he doesn't say that it could be on top of it, which would be an attic, but it presumably is the same idea. Now, Rav Yosef says that in fact, it's not an afta. What a yitzia is a bitka chalila. A bitka chalila is, the word chalil comes from sort of hollow, right? It's referring to like a pergola, like a place that you made with open windows or no windows, but open sides, that's essentially there for decorative purposes. So unlike the afta, which is a storage place that actually has enclosed and is useful, the bitka chalila is a decorative thing that, is pretty in front of your house or the side of your house, but doesn't actually have enclosures and therefore cannot be as useful for storage. Now, says the Gemara, so therefore, Lamand Amar Ifta, Afta, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the one who says it's a storage shed, then, and that's lo misdavna, that's not sold automatically with the house. Koshken bitka chalila lo misdavna. It would be certainly the case that you wouldn't be selling the bitka chalila, which is not really functional as part of the house. It's really just decorative. But lemand amar bitka chalila, if you're saying, according to Rav Yosef, that it's only, you don't sell this decorative thing, aval afta misdavna, but he would understand that a storage unit that is actually, critical or useful in the house, it's like a cellar or even an attic or a room, is sold along with the house because it has function that is similar to the house. It's only the decorative additions that are not sold with the house. Now, Tanai, Rav Yosef taught or quoted Tanaim that shalosh shemot yeshlo. There are actually three ways that the Torah and the Mishnah describes these kind of ancillary side houses, cellar. Again, the words, I don't really have a great word in English, but storage shed, cellar, whatever words we use. And the three words that are interchangeable, and they all come from descriptions of the Beit HaMikdash. If you recall, the Beit HaMikdash is described, I would say, twice in the Nevi'im, right? Once in the Torah. Well, Torah describes a Mishkan. But in the Nevi'im, we describe the Beit HaMikdash twice. Once in the building of Shlomo, who actually built the Beit HaMikdash. And then later much later, in Yecheskel describes and writes about this future Beit HaMikdash, which in some ways overlaps with Shlomo's and in some ways is incredibly different, right?
It's very different. I years ago, I went, it is really different. But more importantly, it differs a lot from the Mishnah in Masechta Midot.
Right. So Charlie brought us the third source, which we're going to quote all three of these sources in a minute. Is the third source is the Mishnaic source, which is the Mishnah Midot, and it's very unclear in the Mishnah Midot whether it's describing Shlomo's Beit HaMikdash, whether it's describing the second Beit HaMikdash, which was never described in our sources. Right. We just don't have a source, or it's describing Yecheskel's Beit HaMikdash, which is presumably some future third Beit HaMikdash. So either way, in all of those descriptions, the Psukim or the Mishnayot describe that there was a central space similar to the Mishkan called an Ulam and a Hichal, and that included the Mizbeach, if there was a Mizbeach, and the Shulchan and the Menorah, etc. But then on the outside, and obviously the Kodesh HaKodeshim with the Aron, if there was an Aron, but outside of that, in the area surrounding it, there were they often say offices, right? They're like chambers that would support the function of the Beit HaMikdash and the storage. And those are what are called Yitzia in the pasuk. Okay, so let's read it inside.
So
In the other place they call it a lishka.
Sorry, what?
In other place they call these places the lishka. So Shkalim they talk about the lishka.
Yeah, so we'll get to Masechet Midot eventually, not so soon. And we talk about the lishkot. The lishkot were outside, right? Those were in the Azara and those were in other places. These are rooms right next to it. Yeah, Miriam, sorry.
Yeah, so no, I was just going to say here they translate it as an annex.
It's a great word. Okay, we'll use annex because it gets the meaning of what our Mishnah is talking about, which is that you have a house and you have an annex to the house. And the question is, do you sell the annex with the house? So it's wonderful. Let's see the three words. The three words are yitzia, which is what our Mishnah used, tsela, which literally means the side, the rib. We've seen the word sela many times, and the Torah uses tsela in many ways when it talks about the Mishkan. And ta. The third word is the word ta, which we use in modern Hebrew as a cell, right? And that's another terminology. These are a cell, basically, a contained space next to the main area. So where do we see these in the psukim? Yitzia d'chtiv. This is in Melachim, when we describe Shlomo's Beit HaMikdash. Hayitzia tachtona, the bottom Yitzia, remember, maybe you don't remember, but in Shlomo and in Yechezkel as well, they describe them as being three layers, that they built three, there was the bottom, the middle, and the top of these Yitziot. They were built on top of each other. So the Yitzia tachtona, which is the bottom one, maybe, or the middle one, chamesh ba'amar rachva, it was 5 amot wide, and they were squares usually, so 5 amot. But either way, you see that the word Yitzia is used for this ancillary or annex-like area. Tsela, the word tsela is used to describe something very, very similar. Dichtiv, because it says, and this is now in Yechezkel's description of the Beit HaMikdash, Vahat tselaot, right, the tselaot, which now we're referring to as the annexes. I don't know if that's a plural for annex. Tsela al tsela shloshim pa'amim. There were 33 tselaot, 11 on each side. One side had none in the behind the Kodesh HaKodeshim, but there were 33 that Yechezkel describes. And the word ta is pamim. Shalosh pamim is the word, is the pasuk. Ta, the third way they're described are as cells. And this also comes from Yechezkel, when it's actually a little earlier in Yechezkel, when he quotes the malach who came and showed him v'hata, the cell, meaning the area around the Beit HaMikdash. Kana echad orach, it was one kaneh long. And remember that the kaneh, the measuring tape that the Navi, that the Malach carried, was 6 amot. The kana echad rochev, and it was 6 wide, so 6 by 6. Ubeina ta'im 5 amot, and in between the ta'im, there were the areas, the spaces of these annexes were 5 amot of either built-up space or open space, whatever it was. But the point is that we're referring to the exact same thing, and we're using 3 different words. Our Mishnah's word of tsela, of yitzia, the word tsela, and the word ta. And further, just so that Charlie's happy as well, we quote a Mishnah, you can also see a reference to this in the Mishnah, where it says in the Mishnah, in Midot, Kotel ha'echal sheish, that the width of the wall of the Heichal behind the Kodesh HaKodeshim was 6 amot, which is a pretty wide wall. The hata sheish, and then the open space, the ta, which is the office, the annex, all the words we're using, the storage space was 6 amot, right? Did I say 6? Yeah. And then kotel hata chamesh, and then behind that there was another 5 amot of a wall. Either way, these are all
until about 1900. Walls of anything tall had to be very wide in order to support the weight.
Okay.
So because they didn't have steel frame construction yet. And the last major tall building that was built without steel frame is Philadelphia City Hall, which I saw last month and did a tour of it. And after that, buildings could have thin walls.
Thank you,
so
thank you, Charlie, for taking us around the world of architecture.
Well, this is actually makes it very realistic that this is probably an accurate description. Right.
I agree. The challenge, of course, and not that this is our sugya today, is that there are several alternative accurate descriptions, and they don't overlap.
They're not consistent, right?
That is true. Anyways, but the whole point of our Gemara is, besides it's always fun to talk about the Beit HaMikdash and Mishnayot and other psukim, is that these are synonyms for what we're describing in our Mishnah, which are not the main room, but side rooms that are either storage places or antechambers or what was the word again? Annexes, right? So those are the questions. Are those included in the sale? Says the Gemara. Now we are 12 lines from the bottom, middle of the word of the line. Amar Mar Zutra, says Mar Zutra. Just to point out to you, the whole discussion in our Mishnah about when you sell a main building, do you sell the annex? It only is a question if the annex is large enough to be substantial on its own. If the annex is small, like it's 2 amot, it's a tiny little side closet, then it for sure is included because it has no identity to be sold or to be used on its own. So it says Mar Zutra, Hu dahavi arba amot. It's only if this side room is 4 amot by 4 amot, 4 by 4. That's the minimum chashuv size, right? Amalei Ravina le Mar Zutra. So Ravina said to Mar Zutra, "L'didachta amar adahavi arba amot." According to you, the only time a side room can be excluded or will be excluded is if it has 4 amot. But what about the next Mishnah? Elamiata Gabi Bor. Right, the next Mishnah gets into the next question, which is you sell a house, and in the back of the house, there's a very nice pit, right? Is the pit included in sale of the house, right? Yes or no? So it's a very similar question to an annex, right? And the Mishnah says, we're going to quote the Mishnah, give you a sneak peek of what's coming on, I think, Wednesday. It's none. Mishnah says, if you sell a house, you don't sell lo et bar v'lo et dot. Right, the bar is like when you dig in the ground. The dot is when you lift up and you have like a cistern on, or whatever, like a water tower. So you don't sell those things together. Now you're implying that that's only. And sorry, let me finish the Mishnah. Even though you wrote in the contract, I'm selling you the house and all the width and depth of the house. You don't mean ancillary things that were built onto the house. Again, we'll discuss that Mishnah in a few days. But says Ravina to Mar Zutra, Hachanami, are you telling me that also is Ihavi Arba Amot in Ilolo? Are you telling me that also is only true if your bar is 4 by 4 now, which would be very unusual because a bar is usually not, or not always, 4 by 4. You can make a bar that's much smaller than that. So you're saying you only exclude the space if it's large. Is that true in that Mishnah too? And he answered him, no, I don't think it's true in that Mishnah. Hachi hashta. This here is different. Because hatam hatashmishta lechod hatashmishta lechod. In the later Mishnah, when we talk about a water storage place, you're selling a person a house, let's say, or a field, whatever you're selling. It has one function. The water is not the same function, right? It's important, but it's not the same thing. And therefore, it's definitely excluded, even if it's very small, right? That's one explanation. But here in our Mishnah, both things, the house and the storage, the annex, can be used together, right? It's basically ancillary to the house. It's different because it's not a house, but it's the same tashmish. And therefore, if the secondary space is 4 amot, then you view it as being a separate space on its own, and it's not included automatically with the sale. But ilo lo chashiv. But if it doesn't have arba by arba amot, then you say it's batel to the house. Then it's considered to be secondary, and it's included when you sell the house. So that is
the bore outside the house?
The bar is outside the house. Yeah.
Is the bore outside the house?
The bar is outside the house. Yeah.
So if the bore is inside the house, it would be included.
Presumably.
But a person builds a mikveh inside his house.
Right. Presumably it will be included, but let's wait till we get to the Mishnah. I don't recall if the Gemara goes through the details of the mikveh. So a few days ahead of us. Continues the Gemara now, the last 2 lines on Daf Samach Aleph Amud Aleph. It says in our Mishnah, you didn't sell lot cheder shelifnim mimenu, you didn't sell the room that is inside, meaning the second apartment, basically inside the first one. Says Gemara, I don't get it. Hashta yitzialo misdaven. Look, if you didn't sell the little storage space that's next to it, that really is just an annex, cheder miboy, you have to tell me you didn't sell a room which is its own individual house, basically. Lo tzricha, says Gemara, well, you're right. It seems to be obvious that if you sold the outer apartment, you didn't sell the inner apartment. But the chiddush of our Mishnah is, even if you wrote in the contract, afagav de meitzer le mitzri avroi, even though you delineated, and we're going to get tomorrow, as you can see from the beautiful pictures on your left, to a lot of written contracts and what you write. But even though you wrote in the contract, I'm selling you the space that is on, that's bounded by, 232nd Street and 231st Street, and that's where I live, and Henry Hudson. You lay out the borders, and they are borders that are external to the whole structure. So they cover the outside apartment and the inside apartment. So you might think I'm selling you both, right? But even if you say that, it doesn't mean it. Kid Rav Nachman. It's like, as Rav Nachman is going to quote, we're going to discuss now for the rest of today, the halacha of Rav Nachman, which is that sometimes you give boundaries that are larger than what you're selling because it's the only way you can make a clear distinction about what you're selling. Meaning, to describe to someone of saying, I'm going to sell you the place that's on the west side corner of this lot becomes very non-specific. So therefore, you describe basically the whole lot as the place what you're selling, even though you're only selling one house within that lot. And so even in that case, if you're not explicit and say, I'm selling you both houses or both rooms, then even though the boundaries you gave encompass both of them, it doesn't include a sale of both of them. And where did Rav Nachman say that? Dam Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, third line now. Hamocher bayit chavero bebira gedola. Very modern problem. You sell a house to someone, but it's in a larger structure. A bira gedola, again, I don't know the English. I use apartment building when I just read this, but obviously it's not exactly what they meant. A bira, which it means a big, say a brownstone, I'll use it for a second. And in a bira, there are individual houses or rooms or apartments, and there is common space. Okay, and this is a critical thing. There's common space where you had the Amazon packages and the ping pong table or whatever the restaurant does not use either of those examples, but you had things in your common space. Now, one person, Ruvain, owns the whole brownstone, let's say, and he sells a house within the brownstone to Shimon. The question is, does it include the whole house, basically, the common space, or not, right? Now, the challenge is, says Rav Nachman, I'll read it inside. A person sells a house to his friend inside a larger structure, larger called apartment building, then even though he said the borders of what I'm selling you encompass the whole building, right? So you gave him the external borders, meaning the largest borders. Then says Rav Nachman, he doesn't mean it. Mitzarim hirchivlo. He broadened. He was generous when he wrote the borders, meaning he wasn't literal. He was being marchiv the borders, and he really just meant to sell him the apartment within that building, not the common space and not everything else that was part of that building, even if he owned it. Okay.
But it sounds like similar to a co-op or a condominium. The people buy their co-ops, but they don't buy, quote unquote, the common space. They can use the common space, but they don't own that common space.
Obviously it's complex, right? So potentially, but here the point has to be here where he could have sold him the common space, right? It was within the rights of Reuven, let's say, he must have owned it to sell to Shimon the common space. The question is, did he mean to include it or not? When he said to Shimon, I'm selling you this house, let's say, whatever the words he used, does he mean to include the house and the common space? Because the borders, he said, encompass the whole thing. The reality is that he doesn't, according to Rav Nachman. He's just saying it because it's very hard to describe borders of a house within another larger area. Now, Tosfos here points out, and I just want to point it out because it's an interesting point, that you might think, we're going to actually have this a lot later when we talk about other purchases, that you can maybe divine the understanding based on the price, right? I mean, presumably it costs a different price for buying a house and buying an apartment building, right? So Tosfos points out that the detail, which we of course know, is that ein ona'ah lekarkaot, right? Which is that even though we've talked in Bava Mitzia extensively about how prices have to fix their true value, we really had exceptions to that, or at least very large exceptions when it came to buying real estate, because real estate could have very variable prices, right? The same apartment building, as we all know, the Chrysler building sold for $2 billion a few years ago, and it's now worth a fraction of that, right? Or vice versa. And so there could be very much dependent on the tenants and the location and whether the ground is sinking and things like that. And so in general, there might be cases where you can divine it, but it's not necessarily easily done from the price. So that's Rav Nachman. Now, it says the Gemara, where am I? Hechidam. Ask the Gemara, what exactly happened when they had this sale with 5 lines from the top? If there's different words, right? If people said, I'm selling you a house, they meant I'm selling you an apartment. And they said, I'm selling you a building, they meant I'm selling you the whole thing, just to use those two words. Then pshita, if he said, I'm selling you this house, and the borders he gave him were for the whole building, he clearly only meant the house, right? Bayit zavanle, he sold him a house, bira lo zavanle, he didn't sell him the whole building. Ella, it must be that we're talking about a case where lebira nami karo lebayit. Sometimes, right, like a brownstone, let's say, you call it the house, right? So sometimes people refer to the whole building as a bayit. In which case, why don't you say that if I wrote to him, I'm selling you a house in this place, and the border I gave you encompasses the whole building, kula zavanle. Why does Rav Nachman say that you didn't sell him the whole thing? Says, it obviously has to be a case where the language is not clear. Deruba karile lebayit bayit ulebira bira. The majority of people, in most of the circumstances, we call them different things. We call a house, an apartment, a bayit. We call a building a bira. But there is some wiggle room in terminology. Ikanami de lebira karile bayit. There are some who also call the bira, the larger structure, a house, bayit. And Ma'adatema, I would have thought that since you called it a bayit, which is possible, and you laid out borders that describe the entire bira, that kula zavinle, Kamash Milan, says Rav Nachman, that's not the case. Why is it not the case? and introduces Rav Nachman a beautiful and complicated addition, which is that because there's ambiguity, if you meant Ruvain to sell to Shimon the entire building, let's say, right, meaning including the common space, you would have said that. And the fact that you didn't say it means that you didn't do it, even though you wrote out borders that encompass the whole building. Says Rav Nachman, Kamash Milan, midahavile the michtav. You should have written in your contract. Now, this is a quote: "Velo shiyaret bizvini ilan klum." I'm not leaving behind any extra space in this sale. The fact that you didn't write that, and you could have written that, and it became standard to write that, means that there is reason to assume you meant to leave behind something, that you were selling Ruvain, selling to Shimon, just the apartment, not the common space, and therefore it is not included, right? The fact that you should have written that, below katav, shma mina shiur shire, you see that he left behind, he didn't mean to sell this portion. That's Rav Nachman's Chiddush, and that actually is what we're learning from our Mishnah. Says the Gemara now, a very similar halacha, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, exactly identical halacha, a very similar halacha, Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, if you're selling a field within a large set of fields, okay? So let's say, I'm going to use Ruvain again, because I like using that name, right? Ruvain owns a large amount of property, okay? And it's bounded on one side by Shimon and Levi and Yehuda and Yisachar, there are neighbors, but within his property, he can subdivide his area, we're going to call his large area a bika, his large valley, into multiple fields, right? So he says, I sell we got to get a new name here. I sell to, Binyamin, a field within my field, right? I don't know if she's within my field, in my field, that is bounded by Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, right? So since he said that, it's similar to the house and the court and the bira, right? Because he's not necessarily selling him the entire field. He's selling him a section within that field. But the boundaries he gave describe the whole field. So let's read that inside. Person sells a field to his friend in a large bika where he owns many areas, a lot of property. Even though when he said the boundaries of my bika are the external boundaries that encompass my external neighbors, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, mitzarim hirchivlo, it's a case where you brought in the boundaries and you didn't mean them literally, and you only sold him one standard field. Okay, I'll ask the Gemara the same question. Is there such a thing as a standard field? Hechidami, right? If the terminology was you call a field, meaning a defined place, a field, and you call a bika, a larger area, the word bika, then if you said the word sadeh, you clearly only meant sadeh, right? Pshita, sadeh zavinle. You sold him a sadeh, and bika lo zavinle. You didn't sell him the entire valley, right? Ella, it must be dilibika nami karle sadeh, right? It must be that a bika is sometimes referred to as a sadeh, in which case, if I said to the guy, I'm selling you my sadeh, and I gave him the boundaries of the bika, why didn't I sell him the whole thing? Kula zavanlei. Why don't you say you sold him the whole thing? The same answer we had before, the ika, now most changes to make it parallel, right? That it should be deruba, that most people, karo le sadeh, sadeh, ulabika bika. Most of the time, we actually don't use the words interchangeably, but sometimes we do. Ikanami de la bika karo le sadeh. There are times where we would refer to this whole a bika, again, I don't actually know what English word we would use to describe a big valley, let's say. I mean, bika means a valley, but a large area of farming, that this bika is sometimes called a sadeh. And ma'adatim, I would have thought kula zavinle, kamash malan. Again, what Rav Nachman's chiddush is the same thing. We're going to ask why we need it twice. But the point of Rav Nachman is, midahavi le lemichtavle, you should have written, if the intention in the sale was to have you buy or you purchase or you own the entire valley, then I should have said to you, lo shiyaret bizvine ilan kadmei klum. I am not leaving behind anything in this sale, right? And since he didn't write that, shmamina shiyure shire, you see that the intention of the seller was to sell a field within this bika, just like earlier we said the intention was to sell a bayit within this bira, okay? Now, of course, ask the Gemara, these seem to be two equivalent halachot that Rav Nachman did not need to waste his time, most of our daf today, on repeating it, right? So why do we need both of them? It says the Gemara v'tzricha. We are, I don't know, 2/3 of the way down. Tzricha, you need to have both halachot of Rav Nachman in one in a field and a bika, in a sadeh and a bika, and one in a bayit and a bira. Diyash minam bayit, right? If you had just told me the bayit, I would have said the reason that when you sell a bayit, you exclude the common space is because the common space is not the same function as your bayit, right? Mishum daha tashmishta lechud v'ha tashmishta lechud. Right, in your house you sleep and you eat and you cook, and in the common space you do laundry and play ping pong or whatever you do. Right, it's not the same thing as a house. Now, of course, it has similar functions, but it's clearly a different entity. So I understand that it's not included in the sale of the house. Right, Avo bika. Remember, a bika is really the same valley. There's just different farms within the valley. So you might have thought since it's all one function, basically, ema kula zavanla, that you would be more likely to assume that if you said, I'm selling you a field, and you included boundaries that included the whole bika, that you're selling the whole thing, right? So that's why Rav Nachman had to tell you the field, even though he already told you the house. Now, why didn't you just tell me the field? If you had just told me the field, the nimtzarle, it's really difficult in a field to define boundaries, right? Because again, the boundaries, the fences around the field are the neighbors. Or Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. But within my field, what are you going to say? You're going to say, I'll sell you the field up to the apple tree and next to the grapevine, which of course, might fall down. It might not be there in 100 years or 10 years. And therefore, it's much more difficult to define boundaries in a field. So it's more natural that you would say the existing boundaries, which are the neighbor's fields, right? Even though you don't mean it. You're trying to define the space. Aval bayit, in the house, you can make mimtsar, you can make boundaries much more easily, and you didn't. Lo matzarle, you didn't say, I'm selling you the house, which is 40 feet away from the wall on the south, which goes to 50 feet. You didn't give that description. So therefore, you might think, therefore, kule zavanle, you sold the whole bira, tzricha, and therefore, Rav Nachman said it in two different cases to tell you that it's true in both, that in fact, since, again, the point of Rav Nachman is, the biggest point is, that since you could have written in the contract, I am selling you this house and this entity, and not leaving anything behind, and you didn't say, I'm not leaving anything behind, we assumed you did leave something behind, and you meant to only sell a bayit or only sell a sadeh within the larger collective. Ask the Gemara, Kiman Azla Hadamar of Mari, Brei Debat Shmuel. Right, Rav Mari, the son or bra de Bat Shmuel, of Bat Shmuel, Mishmei de Abaya, said the following: Haiman de mizavni le'midi de chavre. A person who goes to make a sale to his friend, tzarech the michtavle, you're supposed to write in the contract, lo shiaret bizvina ilan kadmei klum. I didn't leave anything behind. Right, I'm selling you, 30 whatever property. I'm selling you 35, 15, I don't know, Henry Hudson Parkway, and I'm not leaving anything behind. So clearly, why would you have to say that? It must be like Rav Nachman, that, again, this is a little bit circular, right? Because Rav Nachman's whole halacha is that since you're supposed to write this, if you don't write it, you don't mean it. And therefore, since you're supposed to write it, and if you don't write it, you don't mean it, you have to write it, right? So that is going kiman Rav Nachman, that you are supposed to, Amar Abba Bavua, that this is in fact supposed to be written in the contract, and there are legal implications if you don't write it. Now, one last thing, because we have time, we are 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines from the bottom. There was a similar kind of case. Again, we'll see why this is overlapping. There was a person who said to his friend, Ara de Bechia mizavnina lecha. Right? I want to sell you the land of Bechia. Now, this you can see why this becomes so complicated, because presumably Rabbi Chia was no longer alive, and this was 100 years later. But the way we have in Riverdale, like the Kennedy house, or they call it, whatever it is, right? So that's, pick a timely thing, right? So they basically had a piece of land that was known as the land of the Chia family, which they were a very prominent family. Rabbi Chia, it's not clear if this is Rabbi Chia or someone else, but either way, it doesn't matter, right? It was known as the land of of Chia's family. So, but on the other hand, obviously, as time goes on, what is included in that description becomes very ambiguous, because Chia's family owned all kinds of houses and many properties and many possessions. And what exactly are you selling when you say the words, right? Ara de Bechia, right? So says the Gemara, Havile tarti arata David mitkaran de Bechia. There were 2 plots of land in that town that were known as the properties of Bechia, right? So when you say, I'm giving, for $1 million, I'm selling you a property of Beichia, what do I mean? So Amar Ravashi, well, says Ravashi, if you have to look at the language of the contract said, Ara de Beichia, Ara is singular, right? Chada Amarle, Tarti lo Amarle. He didn't say two. So therefore only one is sold, okay? Now, of course, it's not clear from our Gemara how you know which one, right? But that, we leave it. We don't discuss it right now. But what if, says the Gemara, continues, Vi Amarle Arata. What if he said lands, plural, right? So then, stama, you would say miut aratashtaim. Then you would say that at least two. Now, in this case, it sounds like he only had two. But if he had 5 plots that were bechia, and you said arata de bechia, all you've included in that is not all the land of bechia, but a minimum of 2 plots of land of bechia. And again, they'd probably have to go to court and you'd have to prove it. And as we usually say, you get the 2 least valuable ones, presumably. But you could see why this gets very confusing. Okay. Vi Amarle. Now, if he said to him, we're 3 lines on the bottom, Kol Arata, right? Then, of course, it means all the land. Kol Arata itle, that means everything that is called under the name of Bechia, but it excludes the bar mi bustanai, bustani upardisi. It only includes open land, right, that you would farm on, but it excludes bustanai, which are gardens, right, beautiful built-up finished gardens, and pardisi, which are orchards, right. So land that is sort of developed, not necessarily for planting, but not necessarily for crops, right, but for orchards or for gardens, is not considered to be land. Land presumably means open land or fallow land, right? But amarle ziara, if you say that, use the word ziara, and the word ziara is a word that we've had before, which means all agriculture, basically. I'm not exactly sure what how it comes to mean that, but it means all planted things. Then afilo bustunai or pardise, right? It would include also the gardens and also the orchards, because those are encompassed under the word zihara, but it would not include the houses, right? It would include the built-up places, because those are not fields, those are not agriculture, those are houses, the bar mibati and avdi, and the servants, right? Let's say there was, obviously we include, unfortunately, and that's how it was, the Yud Avadim is property similar to houses, so it doesn't include the legacy servants and the houses that are on the land. But amarle nichsi, but if you use, we're top of daf samach ben amud aleph, now you know what you have to say if you want to buy an estate. If you say all of the nichsi includes possessions, right? All the nichasim, all the possessions of beichia, then it would include afilo bati va'avdi, would include all the land and the gardens and the vineyard and the orchards and the houses and the servants and the cars, maybe not the cars, sorry, I actually take that back. Everything that's considered to be part of the land, right? The point that the Rashbam brings here is that it would exclude, the jewelry and the pots and maybe the cars, if you call them metaltalim. So it would not include metaltalim, but it would include everything that is fixed, that is part of the land of the Bechia. But the point, again, today is, this is just an ancillary story we brought, is that it's very dependent on the language you use, what is generally meant by that, what is commonly meant in that area, as we saw, right? If people call a bira a house, then obviously when you say bayit, you could include bira. If people don't call a bira a house, then it doesn't include it. If it's ambiguous, then it depends on the other context. In this case, if it was standard to write in a shtar, we're not leaving behind anything, and you didn't write that, you are probably leaving something behind. And then we have to figure out what you leave behind, right? If you sold a house, you left behind the common space, etc. And so that is how we begin our discussion of understanding. We're going to continue and go much deeper as we go in the parak about common usage and understood usage. And tomorrow, as again, I'm just going to point out, because I'm not going to be the one teaching it, there's going to be a lot of beautiful pictures in Rashi, in the Rashbam, and in Tosfot about how you define borders, right? If you say, I'm selling you 100 amot on the west side of Reuven's property, what does that mean? Does that mean 100 amot square, 100 amot in the diagonal? And we'll get to all of that tomorrow in that discussion.
You could say kol nichse, and then it would include all the cars and so forth, right?
That's what the Rashbam says, yeah. If you said kol nichse, then it will be marbe, all possessions.
A couple things. It's not really the case in the East Coast, but in pretty much most of the rest of the United States, there was a standard lot size that was basically 160 acres and at times 40 acres, and they were literally numbered. which made it a lot easier to define. And when we get to boundaries, the boundaries were defined by surveys, so you didn't have to put that in every single deed of sale. And the other thing, there's a practical thing about what goes along with the sale, and it involves local custom in different parts of the United States. Major appliances may or may not convey along with the sale. In Maryland, Virginia, DC, the washer and dryer always went along with the house, whereas in other places, that's not necessarily true. It's something that people used to love to take their washers and dryers with you, and I've done that twice in New York City. So a lot of local custom there as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie. Obviously, you can get out of all these problems by being very explicit in your contract, right?
Absolutely. Everything is negotiable, but the local customs differ even within the United States today. So these are not just that while they're talking about bores and attics and stuff like that, it's different. The principle applies even today.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks to everyone. Shavua Tov. You'll meet tomorrow morning, and I'll see you all, God willing, next Motzei Shabbat.
So I don't think I need to do anything. Oh. Oh, yeah. But that was my to-go. Ooh, that's bad. Oh, it's so low. All right. I proved my point. It's not sensitive. Small variations. The college football moves. I should. Wait. You never. Charging.